This tutorial is going to cover the installation and use of the Edgestitch foot. To swap out this style foot, I'm going to need to remove the whole attachment on my machine that removes the whole shank. Then I'm simply going to line this hole right here with the fitting in the back, and it fits right up on there, and then I just reattach by lowering the lever in the back, and then this is secure to my machine. Now the part of this foot that I need to pay attention to is this metal piece that comes down right here in the center. That metal guide stops just before the opening of the needle, allowing you to use either a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch with this presser foot. So when you raise and lower your needle, you'll notice that it can go right behind the metal guide or over to the left. So I can use that placement to determine the top stitching that I want to have, but it'll give me a good consistent edge line as I stitch out around the pieces that I'm working on. In this example, I'm just going to demonstrate using the Edgestitch foot to stitch a traditional hemline. So this fabric right here, I have two pieces sewn together and the seam allowance is pressed towards the inside. So this is a finished seam line edge. It also could be similar to a folded under hemmed edge, in which you would take this finished edge and line this up with this guide right here. So this is going to be set right next to that guide. And I'm just going to lower my presser foot. And then I'm going to straight stitch with my needle pushed as far over to the left as I have space for it to go. And my stitch length is set at my standard stitch of 3.0. So you can see as I continue to feed that through, this guides this to be an equally distant stitch line from the edge. So here you can see that stitch line, and that looks very nice, very consistent. It's about 1/8 of an inch from the finished edge of my fabric. Now in this example, I have two pieces of fabric sewn together with a seam line. I have my seam allowance pressed to one side, and I'm going to demonstrate using this foot for stitch in the ditch. So the most frequent place you're going to find this on the Liberty Jane patterns would be on the waistband application, where on the capri pants we have a waistband that's sewn in, and then instead of top stitching on top of the waistband where you'd see the stitch line, it's stitched in the ditch, which is in this space of the joining of the two seams together. So to do that with this foot, you're going to set this down so that that metal guide is going right into that space. And you can see that it'll lower down, and it's pressured so it raises slightly. It doesn't push the fabric down, but you're also going to want to make sure that you have your needle in the center position so that it's going exactly where this metal guide is lined up. And the space in the foot at the center is fully open, so the metal guide is only in front of the needle, not underneath it. And here's the stitch seam line. Now we've used white thread so you can see the stitching that goes into that seam line, but if this was done in red, this seam, once it is pressed and relaxed back onto itself, will roll back slightly over that, but it is down inside that fold line, and that is called stitch in the ditch. In this example, I'm going to show you how to use the Edgestitch foot with the zigzag stitch to join two pieces of lace trim that are applied on top of your fabric. So we have two separate pieces of trim right here that are meeting in the middle on the straight edge, and then we're going to run this Edgestitch foot guide right down the center, and then the zigzag will follow behind to join the two pieces together. So you can see that comes out very nicely. Those are joined really smoothly together. So the center spot where those two edges meet looks pretty seamless, and our zigzag stitch is very consistent. So that's a nice way to make sure that you apply your trim very straight and evenly connected along the top of your garment. So something like this could work really well on the front of the Kings Canyon peplum top or the Catalina dress. In this example, I'm just going to show you how to apply a flat piece of trim using a straight stitch, and we're just going to apply that on top of a garment. So you could have something like this happen along a hemline if you wanted to add an extra piece of lace or ribbon and you simply want to attach it along the straight edges consistently and evenly spaced. So I have the Edgestitch foot with the guide is going to run right along the edge of my trim, and I have my needle pressed over just so that it stitches about 1/8 of an inch away. So I'm going to lower that so that the guide is right along the piece of my trim, and on this one I'm just using a standard straight stitch. Now in this example, you can see that this actually stitched right along the edge. So I had pushed my needle over 2 clicks, and I have 3 that I can bump over. So that actually allowed me to stitch exactly just past the edge. If I wanted to come in a little bit more, I could have pushed the needle over. So this is a good reason to try it out, test it before you sew on your actual garment. But this application looks great. And then if I wanted to repeat that on the opposite side, I would simply flip that around and then run it on the other side to top stitch down the second side. And there you can see we have that ribbon applied right along the edges on both sides. So it's nice and smooth, it's nice and consistent, and in this example it's stitched with white, so that thread shows on the edge of this ribbon. If I had used navy blue, you wouldn't notice those stitch lines at all. Here's another quick example of something that I like to do with the Edgestitch foot when I am working with applying a Hong Kong binding to finish a seam opening. So right here I have the front of the Mindle Beach dress, and this is this front princess seam line. So this is the dress front, and I have a seam that goes from the armscye down to the hemline. Now the interior portion of this dress will be finished on the top bodice section with a lining, so I only have my Hong Kong binding going from the middle area of the bodice area down to the hemline, and then the lining is going to cover this top part. So the part I'm concerned with here is just this bottom part where there isn't really that much of a curve. So the pattern is not lined or covered on the bottom, so I would be left with an interior seam right here that is pressed open. So I could simply zigzag these edges or finish them with a serger, but for a little bit more couture or high-end finish, I like to add a strip of Hong Kong binding to that seam. So right here the seam is pressed open, and I have applied this binding to this pressed open edge. So this is the seam right here. The seam is pressed open, and then with the right side to this right side of the interior seam, I've pressed this bias cut piece of binding, and this is a 1/2 inch wide. And I've stitched it at 1/8 of an inch right along the seam line. So I pushed all the fabric out of the way, and I have the seam pressed over to the left on the inside, and then this one is free sticking out. And I've stitched that down at 1/8 of an inch. And now I've pressed this back up over, and then I'm going to flip this over so I have the wrong side up, and the seam is still pressed over on this side. So I'm just working with this one side of the seam line. And I'm going to press this bias strip over the raw edge, and then on the front side I'm going to use my Edgestitch foot to stitch right here along the edge of this bias trim to create the Hong Kong binding. So I'm just going to place my strip right here with that edge guide right next to that, and it's pressed under the seam allowance. You can see here it's pressed underneath, and I just want to catch that on the bottom side to create that covered bound edge. And there you can see we have that now, so I'm going to repeat that process on both sides, and then when this seam is pressed open, I have a very nice finished edge. And on the inside you can see that that caught that nicely. I actually have more than I need. So if I wanted to come back with my small scissors and trim this back a little bit closer to the stitching line, I could. But it fits nicely under that seam allowance and it will stay pressed open. And then again, I'll repeat that on the opposite side, and then the interior of the dress will just have a nice finish for all those seams that are pressed open.